This is a quick video tutorial SketchUp to cover just a few points, groups, components, moving objects, and making some geometric changes to some rectangular objects. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a few tags because they will be useful in demonstrating some of the steps to come. And there's no harm in showing you how to make a few tags. You'll learn some of the benefits of using tags here. So on the right hand side of my screen, under the default tray tags, I'm going to click the plus sign, and I'll just call that one number 1 for now, and number 2, and number 3. Of course, you can use your own names. You can use descriptive names, which I usually use, such as finishes, structure, walls, doors, etc. Okay, now we have 3 tags. So I'm going to create a rectangular beam. I'll make a 2x4. I'll start with a 2x4. So Q is my keyboard shortcut for rectangle. I clicked at the origin there because it's a convenient spot, dragged, and now I'm going to type 3.5, 1.5. That gives me a rectangle of 1.5 inches by 3.5, which is a standard sized 2x4 for framing. I'm going to use the push-pull tool, which is keyboard shortcut P, and I'll extend it up 60 inches, 5 feet. So now I've got a 5-foot long 2x4. Let's see. I'm going to make another, to demonstrate some of the reasons for grouping, I'm going to make another object here. Doesn't matter where I do it. I'll make it 12 by 12, and I'll use P to pull it up 12 inches. I've got a 12 by 12 by 12 cube. Now let's suppose I've got another cube, but I'm going to make it 3 by 3 by 3. So I'll put it here, 3 by 3, 3 comma 3, and push pull to bring it up 3. And that's all fine and dandy. But now just suppose that I decided I want to move the small cube to a different spot on the top of the large cube. I could select it, but if I try to move it, M is the shortcut for move, it creates a problem. See that? It doesn't move separately from the big cube. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to back up. Control Z backs me up. I've got my big cube. I'm going to triple click on it. That selects everything. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to call it Make Group. Now that big cube is an object which I can move as I choose. A single click selects the entire object. If I double click, I'm now within that group, and I can select individual faces, individual lines, and I can edit it. Click away from it to close the group. Now if I want to put my 3-inch cube on top, 3 comma 3, P for push pull, 3 inches up, I will repeat that and make that a group. Now I can move that independently of the cube below it. I can put it back there, I can put it over. Can put it in all kinds of places that way. Now they can be independently manipulated. So that is the reason, one of the main reasons for grouping objects, and it's an incredibly powerful tool that you will use all the time. I hardly make anything without immediately turning it into a group or a component. So what's the difference between a group and a component? Let's move this over. Move it over. Okay, how did I move? Okay, I selected it, M for move, and I want to make a copy. So I'm going to hit the control key. I'm just going to tap the control key. Don't need to hold it down. Now a little plus sign shows up next to my cursor. I'm going to click to 2 different spots. In this case, it doesn't really matter where I put it, so I'm just randomly clicking 2 locations, but I could have done that and then typed, say, 36 for 36 inches, and now it will have moved it exactly 36 inches. Okay, so now I've got two instances of this group. If I change one of them, the other one stays as it was, and that may be a feature that I want. So in that case, grouping is a good thing. But suppose for some reason I want to change this one and make it different than that one. I can double click into the group, and change it like I just did, or I can also explode it. X is explode. Now it's not a group anymore, it's just a bunch of separate pieces again, whereas that one's still a group. Something else I can do, I can select everything, right click, and then instead of making it a group, I can make it a component. And it will ask me to give it a name. I will call it cube 12. So that's now a component instead of a group. I'm going to make a copy of that. M for move, control to make a copy. I'll drag it 36 inches over. Now, if I change that one, the original changes as well. Or vice versa. If I change the original, the copy changes. That's the difference between a component and a group. That's a group. That one there's a group. That one there's a component. If you look in the entity info window in the top right, you'll see it says solid component 2 in model, and it has definition. That's the name that I gave it. If I click on my original group, it says solid group 1 in model. If I copy the group, move it, now I've got 2 in model. So groups and components, that's the key difference, and both are very powerful and helpful to use. So let's go back to our 2x4 over here. We haven't done anything to it yet. It's just sitting there, a bunch of faces and edges. I'm going to make it into a group. Right click, make group. I'm going to get rid of this stuff now. I don't need it anymore. Okay, so I've got a 2x4, and let's suppose I wanted to make a shed. It's going to have 2x4s for the walls and 2x6s for a sloped roof. Well, I'm going to take my 2x4. I'll build a little wall here. I'm going to make a copy. I'm going to rotate. R is rotate. Hit the right arrow to lock it onto the red. Click on a corner. Oh, and I want to hit the control button because I want to make a copy as I rotate, and I'll rotate it 90 degrees. All right, there's my plate, there's my sole plate, and there's my stud. And I'm going to M for copy, control, M for move, control for copy. I'm going to move copy 16 inches out. I just typed 16, enter. And let's say I'm going to have 4 of those, so I now type 4 times 4. If you look in the bottom right corner of the screen, you'll see a little window that says distance times 4. That tells me what I've been typing. I can see that as I'm typing. I'm going to use the scale command, S for scale. I'm going to stretch my 2x4 out to the end there. I'm going to make rotate another copy, R for rotate. I press the right arrow to lock it on that red axis. Click from a corner to rotate. Click first rotation point and 90 degrees. I typed 90 degrees. Now I've got my top plate. Come around to this side. I used scale last time. Scale gave me this little set of handles, and I used that handle there to pull it. Instead of using scale this time, I'm going to just double click in there. Select the end, M for move, and then I'll just pick a convenient point to move it. That's another way of making the same thing. So now I've got a wall here, and I'm going to make a copy of this wall. I just selected the whole wall, M control for copy. I'll move it over 8 feet. I moved it 8 feet. That's actually 3.5 inches. I'd like to have it 8 feet total. And I've got 8 foot 3.5, so I'll move it back 3.5 inches. M for move. I moved it back 3.5 inches. Now those two walls are 8 feet apart. From outside to outside, they're 8 feet apart. Okay, we have two walls now that are 8 feet apart, and they're 5 feet 3 inches high. D is the tape measure tool, distance, D for distance. I'm going to click on the bottom point, gives me a little tape measure there. I'm going to pull it up to the top point. I don't need to click. It tells me it's 5 foot 3, just in case you wanted to know. And what I'm going to do is I want to make this wall 2 feet higher. So I've just clicked selected the top plate. There are a lot of ways you could do this. I think this is probably one of the most direct. I selected the top plate. I'm going to press M for move, and I'm not making a copy, so I'm not pressing the control key. I'm going to click on a convenient point on a vertical edge somewhere and drag it up vertically. That tells it to move on in the vertical direction. Alternatively, I can also press the up arrow, and that will lock it in the vertical direction. And then I type 24 for 2 feet. I can type 2 foot, the foot sign, or I can type 24 inches. I find inches are generally better to work in. So now that is 2 feet, and we can double check that with our measuring tape. D for measuring tape, 2 feet. It shows me 2 feet. Now we have a bunch of studs that are too short. So I'm going to click and drag from right to left to select all the studs. And I'm going to use the stretch tool again, that's S, and that allows me to stretch the entire group. I'm going to grab this little handle in the center here, click once on that, and let the mouse hover over a convenient point there, and it stretches that entire group up to meet the top plate. So now we have 2 walls that are 8 feet apart, and one wall is 2 foot taller than the other. At this point, each stud and plate are individual groups. Let's suppose for some reason we wanted to group our studs separately from our plates. I'm going to go back into my tags here, and I'm going to rename these tags. I'm going to rename that one, number 1, I'm going to rename that studs. Number 2, I'll rename that plates. And number 3, I'm just clicking right on it twice to bring it up there. Number 3, I will rename that rafters. Rafters. Okay, now I have separate tags for plates, rafters, and studs. So if I wanted to, for some reason, see just my studs and nothing else, a convenient way to do that would be to select all of the pieces that I want to have studs. Just holding the shift key down while I select them all. That selects all the pieces I want to have as studs. I could just go into entity info, and where it says tag, I could put studs, and each stud individually would be on the stud tag. Another way to do it is, now that I've selected them all, I can right click and make that grouping of objects into its own group. And I could put that group onto the studs layer, the studs tag. Now if I go into my tray that says tags and click on the little eye symbol next to studs, that will turn off the visibility. Oh, they disappeared. Don't worry, they aren't lost. They didn't get erased. They're just simply turned off so I don't see them. Just if they're in the way of something else I'm working on, I don't want to have them in the way, I can just turn off that tag and they go away. I can click back on the eye and they will reappear again. I will do the same for the plates. I will select my 4 plates. I will right click, I will make group, and I will put that group on the plates tag. So now if I click on that little eye symbol, the plates go on and off. Also, if I want to move this whole thing, for example, 10 feet over, well, it moved all the studs. It didn't move the plates, but I want the plates too. I could go back and I could move the plates as well, separately, or I could just select both groups, the studs group and the plates group, and move them both. All right. So that's a bit on grouping. That can be used for visibility purposes. It can be used to make it easier to work inside your model. If you were doing a complicated building, you could put all of the interior walls on their own tag, and you could put all the exterior walls on their own tag, for example. And then while you're working on the interior, you could turn off the exterior walls and not have them in the way of your work. Those are some of the things you can do with tags and groups. You can also nest groups. So let me create another tag, and we'll call that shed. And this is going to be our entire shed is going to end up, once it's all done, it's going to end up grouped into a single group. I've just selected my studs group and my rafters, my studs group and my plates group. I'm going to right click. I'm going to make those two a group, and I'm going to put that on shed. Now I have a group that's on the shed tag. You can see that under entity info. If I double click to go into it, I have still got my studs group and my plates group. I can still turn any of them on and off individually. All right, this next little bit is going to be a bit tricky. What I'm going to do is I want to make 2x8 rafters that span from one wall to the other. It'll be a shed roof sloping in one direction. And so I'm going to need to make a 2x8 first, just to make one 2x8 to start with. And I could make a copy of one of my 2x4s and manipulate the shape of it. Instead, I'm going to just do another one from scratch. I think in this case that'll be simplest. And let's see, I will start by Q for rectangle. I'll pick a spot here, drag, and a 2x8 is going to be 1.5, 1.5, comma 7.25. That's 1.5 inches by 7.25 inches. That actual size of a 2x8. I'm going to use P push pull, and I'm going to make it 120 inches or 10 feet long. There's my rafter, and I'm going to triple click on it to select everything, and I'm going to make it a component. I'm going to use component for this because I'm going to make one of them and then make some changes to it, and then I want the changes copies, and then I want to make the changes apply to all the copies. So having it as a component will be helpful. So make component, and we will call it rafter 1. Create. Okay. Now, when I'm working with a sloped roof, I like to draw the roof flat first, like I've done here, rather than try to create the geometry in a sloped manner. I like to create the geometry in a simple XYZ flat way and then rotate the entire object. I usually find it easier to do it that way. So I'm going to take my rafter, I'm going to move it. I'm going to grab one corner here, M for move. I'll pull it up to here for now. R for rotate. I want to rotate it around the vertical axis, so I hit the up arrow. Click, click. I'll rotate it 90 degrees. Let's rotate it again. Okay, now it's flat. We're not going to want it flat. That's okay for the moment. What we're going to want to have happen is we want the rafter to go from, I'm going to draw some little circles just to aid what we're seeing. we want the rafter to be resting on that corner of the wall there, and we want it to be notched into the wall at the top. Up there. So what I'm going to do is take my rafter, and I'm going to rotate it around this point, the center of this circle. So R for rotate. The left arrow locks it to the green axis. I'm going to click on the point I want to rotate around, the center point of rotation. And then I'm going to click on the edge and drag and lift my mouse up until it finds that corner at the top there. So now that rafter rests right on the inside edge of this wall and on the outside edge of this wall. If I look at the rafter itself, double click in there, we can see that my XYZ axis, the red, green, and blue lines, still align with the geometry of the rafter itself rather than the geometry of the model itself. Here we see the red axis, the green axis, and the blue axis. I do it that way because when I'm inside the component, if I want to make changes to this, it finds the parallel axes really easily. You see the blue, the green, the red. So I generally recommend doing it that way. I'm not going to dwell on that any further at the moment. I can get into that later, but I want to move on to something else here. I'm going to move this rafter now, and I'm going to pull the rafter off in one 6-inch overhang down at the low wall. So I'm going to take this rafter and I'm just going to click M for move, click on it at one of the edges, carefully holding the mouse over the edge, parallel to edge, and then type 6, enter. And that moved it 6 inches along that length of the rafter. So if I were to actually measure the distance from the bottom tip to the stud, that's a little less than 6 inches because it measured the 6 inches on the angle of the rafter itself. Now let's just suppose I wanted it actually 6 inches from the wall horizontally rather than at an angle. What I would do is I can use D for my tape measure, and this will give me a guideline. I can click on an edge and pull my mouse over in the red direction and type 6. And that gives me a dashed guideline. That's not physical geometry. That will disappear if I wanted to. But it gives me a dashed guideline. And I'm going to do another dashed guideline on the edge of the rafter itself. And we see that these two guidelines intersect right where I've got my mouse. So if I move my rafter, take the corner, and move it down to that intersection of those two guidelines, now that bottom corner of the rafter is 6 inches directly to the face of the stud. So those are two different ways to move objects, and that's how to use guidelines to help you move things more carefully where you want them. Now, if I were building this, I would be making, let me get rid of this symbol here. And this one, don't need those anymore. If I were framing this, I would actually have what they call a bird's mouth cut on the rafter. It would be cutting out that little bit of triangle so that the rafter sits tightly on top of the wall. I can go into this rafter and I can use L for line, and since that other geometry is there behind it already, it's easy to find those points. That's the little piece that I want to remove. That's the little piece I want to get rid of. So I'm going to use P, which is the push-pull tool. That's that. I'm going to push it in the direction away from me, and I'm letting my mouse hover over the other back corner there. Click. And now it has removed that piece of rafter. The notch is gone. So I will pull the rafter out here a foot just so we can see it better. There's the notch. Now let's suppose if for some reason I don't have the geometry conveniently underneath it that I can click to like I just did. But suppose, for example, it's over here and I want to do a similar notch over here. Well, I could just put it back. That would be the easy way to do it. Normally that's what I would do, but I want to show you a different approach. I can pull guidelines like I did a minute ago. I can use D for measuring tape. Click on this vertical edge of this stud, dragging it in the green direction. That would be the left arrow, locks it to the green axis. I'm hovering over the face of the rafter now. And you can see that it says 1 foot. So it's drawing the guideline parallel to this stud 1 foot over, which happens to be on the face of this rafter. I can do a similar guideline on this top edge. Again, left arrow, green axis. And I can do one more from the left edge of the stud, pull it over, and now I have guidelines that I can work with. So I can go into my rafter, L for line, and it will find those guidelines. So I don't always have to have physical geometry. You can use guidelines the same way. Now I've got P for push-pull. Click on the piece that I want to push-pull and get rid of. I want to take it through to the opposite edge. There it is. There's my notch. Okay, so we've made a rafter and it's got 2 notches in it, and we're going to put it back to the top of the wall. Put it back out here. I've got a bunch of guidelines, all these little dashed lines. I don't need those anymore. I'm done with them. E is erase. Control E erases guidelines. Yeah, Control E erases guidelines. So that's a quick way to get rid of them. I want to move my rafter back 12 inches back to put it back on top of the wall. And I want to put rafters 16 inches apart. Actually, what I want to do is the rafters line up with the studs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the first one, M for move, Control for copy. I'm going to click on the bottom corner of this closest stud. I'm going to drag my mouse in the direction of the next stud. Click on that. And it will move my rafter, a copy. It'll make a copy of my rafter directly aligned with the stud. Now I could just press star 2, and that'll make, or let's say star 3, and that'll make 3 copies instead of just 1. They will be equally spaced based on the spacing of the first one. Looks like I need one more. I selected it, M for move, Control to then turn that into a copy. And there we go, there's the next one. Now I've got all my rafters, and then I thought, oh look, I've got too big of an overhang on the top rafter. I'm going to have to erase all of those and start over again. Nope, I don't need to do that. All I have to do, since they're components, is change one of them and they will all change. So let's see, I have to decide. This is called a square cut on the bottom of the rafter here, and a square cut at the top, and a square cut on the top of a rafter on a shed roof. Not only looks weird, it's not very good detailing for water. So I think I'm going to make what they call a plumb cut. That means that it'll be a perpendicular line rather than at a right angle. So to make a plumb cut, what I can do is make a guideline, D, click on a convenient vertical line somewhere to serve as a guideline, and then hover my mouse over the top corner there. And now I have a guideline that I can work with when I go double click inside my rafter, L for line. See how it's following the guideline that I just created at the bottom. And now push pull, P for push pull. Select that and push it to the other edge. And all 5 of the rafters adjusted because they are components and they're all identical. Now I have a plumb cut. So that's a way to do some manipulations on the rafters. Now suppose that I had not made that guideline and I wanted to go into this rafter and do a plumb cut. It's a little bit awkward because the rafter geometry, the X, Y, Z axes, the red, green, blue axes of this rafter are aligned with the rafter itself, and the plumb line that I want is with reference to the studs that are out here away from it, not conveniently on one of the 3 axes of the rafter. So if I were to start here, it doesn't really know where plumb is. It can't find plumb. It can find this edge, it can find this edge, it can find that edge, that's all great, I can come out along there. But it doesn't want to do a line parallel to these rafters. So that's where the guideline comes in handy. D, and now I have a guideline. It's plumb. On the other hand, if I did want to make changes to the rafters, for example, if I wanted to do some kind of notching down at the bottom, for example, and I wanted to use the straight edges of the rafter itself, I could do a square, maybe 2 by 2, and push that out. So that's different ways to, let me go back and redo the plumb cut up here. Different ways to edit the geometry of rafter of components that are angled. So as you may recall, I started by making my rafter in the XYZ system of the whole model itself, the red, green, blue axes of the model itself, and then I rotated the rafter after the fact, and then I edited the shape of the rafter once it was rotated. Let's put a plywood roof deck on top of this. So I'm going to draw L for line, starting in one corner. I'm following the green axis, but now I'm not following any of the model axes because I want to go up to the top corner up here, across and back. And having closed my 4 sides, I have a face that I can now use P for push-pull. And I'll push-pull it a 1/2 inch, thickness of a sheet of plywood. Triple-click to select it and make it a group. So now I have a sheet of plywood on top of my rafters. Supposing that good example. Notice that the bounding box, when I've selected it, is big and seems to take up a lot of space. That's because it grouped all of this within the red, green, blue axes of the overall model. So I'm going to get rid of that now, and I'm going to make another one. I'll just do it flat on the ground, and you'll see the difference. Rectangle. I'll make that 2 feet by 2 feet. Pull it up a 1/2 inch. I'll make a group out of it. And now I'm going to move this little piece of plywood, grab that corner of it, pull it up here. And now notice that the bounding box is tight to the plywood. I'm going to rotate that to match the rafter. Now I can double click to go inside of it, P for push-pull, pulling it up to the top edge. Around this side, push-pull this side, over here. Alright, so superficially it looks the same as the other one I just made. But if I click on it, notice that the bounding box is tight to the sheet of plywood itself. So I made that second sheet following the same approach as I did with the rafters. That pretty well sums up everything I wanted to cover. So we looked at making components and making groups, the difference between components and groups. Groups are individual sets of items. A component can be, the copies of the component will change if you change any of the components themselves. Let me see if I can say that better. Make an object, group it, and then make a copy of the group, and if you edit one of them, the other won't change. That's groups. Components. Make an object, put it together as a component, make a copy of the component. Now, if you change either of the one, either the original or the copy, both will change. So that's the difference between groups and components. And then we looked at the axes, the model axis, and if you make the object and then rotate it, you get a different result than if you make the object in the final sloped geometry. Okay, thanks. Hope this helps.